Chapter 1 In a Fog Finding the Essence of Wildlife Management. I don't know much about flying, Earl, I said, but I sure wouldn't want to land a float plane if I had to feel the water before I saw it. Earl nodded his agreement, but paused contemplatively before saying anything, as was his habit. It was mid-afternoon on the day our bush pilot was scheduled to return. Earl and I had walked to the water's edge to check the visibility for landing by the float plane we expected to ferry us out. The fog was as dense over the water as it had been around our camp in the spruce stand. "You've got a point, Tom," he replied. "Flying a plane is easy. Landing, of course, is the tricky part. Unless this weather clears, that pilot won't be coming for us today. Maybe we can call in for an update." "Well, there is good news and bad news," I added. "The good news is that the cell phone batteries are still strong. The bad news is that we have absolutely no reception today." I knew we were in for a longer stay. I didn't anticipate that, by the time the plane arrived. My companions and I would think differently about what it means to be a wildlife manager. We had been in a remote camp for 2 weeks and our job was done, but the weather was too rough for even the most daring bush pilot to attempt a landing. Part of a cadre of volunteers from the wildlife agencies, the six of us were recruited for emergency response to a catastrophic situation affecting wildlife. We flew into this camp to monitor a stretch of coast for wildlife affected by an oil spill. Other teams, like ours, were stationed along the coast. Each team was to record numbers and species of wildlife, dead and alive, along a 12-mile section of coastline. Team members were each responsible for a 2-mile segment, recording observations at randomly selected points. Data from all the emergency response teams would be combined to assess the spill's impact on wildlife. The weather had mostly cooperated, and we had enough days of observations during the 2 weeks to meet the protocol. But as we started to break camp, a heavy fog rolled in. Not unusual, but untimely. The members of our team worked for different agencies and organizations in different regions of the country, so it was not surprising that we met for the first time on this project. We were all wildlife managers, but our experience ranged from a few months to a few decades. Now, with our assignment completed, we had the opportunity to learn even more about each other, because it would be another day at least before the weather would break. "As much as I want to get back," I said, "it's been refreshing to get away from the office and actually work on only one task. Following a simple data collection protocol was a nice break from meetings, phone calls, and emails." "I know what you mean," Earl agreed, but it looks like we'll have to make one decision here pretty quick. How to divvy up food, because our supplies are getting lean." Earl, the oldest of our crew, had a taciturn nature we initially mistook for grouchiness. We learned soon enough, however, that beneath his stern demeanor was a very thoughtful, bright gentleman. Returning to camp, we reported to the rest of the crew what they had expected. We were socked in for at least another day. Our camp was decidedly shy of elaborate or luxurious. The flagship accommodation was a rectangular log cabin with an entryway mudroom and closet, 2 bunk rooms, and a large kitchen, dining, living room. Hand-hewn beams spanned a modestly vaulted ceiling. There were plenty of windows, but all the panes had a shadowy purple, translucent sheen from decades of lamp oil, smoke, and neglect. The sooty glow from the oil lamps made the cabin interior more eerie than homey. With a cedar shake roof of not too ancient vintage, the structure was simple, spacious, sturdy, and a bit dank, but it was adequate shelter. And though it smelled of dinosaurs, old newspapers, and countless generations of well-nourished mice, the place tidied up nicely. Within a couple days of our arrival, we gained a sense of residency. Water was hauled from a nearby spring, filtered, and then boiled on an ancient but functional stove that also was our main source of indoor heat. which didn't amount to much at best. A tool shed and a drafty one-holer completed our compound. The buildings had been constructed long ago as a lumber camp outpost. They were used most recently as a seasonal base of operations for a succession of graduate students on a long-term Martin study that concluded several years before. The fog gave us the first day to enjoy a leisurely pace, and all of us were inclined to relax by reading, napping, refining an aptitude for cribbage, or some combination of those activities. We had worked hard, although independently, on our common assignment, and what little time we had at camp had been devoted to preparing and eating meals, doing chores, and sleeping soundly. We had been together long enough to get an inkling of each other's true character. We also had been there long enough to get a peek at each other's idiosyncrasies, but not long enough to be annoyed by them. We were finding comfort in the company and achieving detente by learning who needed quiet, who needed joke, and who needed to hum Do You Know the Muffin Man every morning until there was a semi-serious threat of bodily harm if he persisted. We were novel to each other, generally respectful and friendly, if not a little too reserved. It was a collegial group. Now, toward mid-afternoon of what might prove to be our last day together, I thought I would find out a bit more about my companions. So, Susan, how did you wind up so far from home? Susan looked over at me, and smiled. Just lucky, I guess. Tripped on a prairie dog, ricocheted off of Idaho, and landed here. Say what? Said Earl, with a quizzical glance. Susan had been the most serious and pensive of our team, so her light response was a surprise. Long story, she replied. What do you mainly work on? I asked. Managing people, she replied. Are you in public affairs or I&E? I continued. No, ho, ho, I cringe when people think information and education professionals are the only ones who have to worry about people. I'm in the species management section of our state agency. My work covers the whole state, and I spend a lot of time dealing with public concerns about too little or too much wildlife, depending on the species and the area. It's a constant battle trying to find the right balance. Why don't they call us people managers instead of wildlife managers? Joe chuckled as he opened the wood stove to check the fire. That's primarily what most of us do. Industrious and a fuss budget, Joe was quick with a laugh and had a smile permanently etched on his broad face. He appointed himself the designated snorer, and it proved to be a role at which he was well accomplished. The grief we gave him about his nighttime rumblings provided us with a sense of fraternity, and Joe actually relished the comic relief of complaints about his noisy adenoids. I probably wouldn't have taken my job if they'd called it people management, Earl said. I think most of us got into this profession to do what we've been doing for the past couple of weeks, working in the field up close and personal with wildlife. When I started college sometime during the early Pleistocene, I didn't know much about the profession, and I thought I was going to be working outdoors all the time, hands-on with wildlife. I also thought that those years in college meant I'd be calling all the shots, not John Q. Public. I had no such illusions when I got into the field, said Pat, the youngest and least talkative of the team members. We knew he received a master's degree only a year before, so we assumed his reticence was either shyness or the fact of his being essentially a professional rookie, rather than it being a matter of age difference. I had it pretty well drummed into me in school that people are at the center of wildlife management. Actually, we learned never to say we manage people. People will resent it if we say we are trying to manage them, but we were told time and again that we need to understand people because in managing wildlife, we ultimately would be managing public resources to provide benefits for people. Whether they knew it or not, Earl added, I know I didn't realize that the people aspects of wildlife management would become so all-consuming at times. That's been a big change over the course of my career. Like in that Bob Seger song, I added. I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. Who's Bob Seger? Pat asked. I think my grandparents listened to his music, Becky joked. Not much older than Pat, Becky had shown herself to be a tireless and talented worker. She complimented those traits with a genuine and inoffensive perkiness. I gave her a mock, condescending harumph. I guess that shows we're from different generations, I said. But back to your point about working with people, Pat, it seems like that's all I do. That's why I jumped at the opportunity to join this team. Like I told Earl earlier, this has been a refreshing change of pace. What do you do for the feds, Becky? Earl asked, getting up and walking a bit stiffly to the firewood box. I work in species management and do a lot of environmental review work, she replied. I do my share of people management too. This detail seemed like a good chance to reconnect with the things that interested me in becoming a wildlifer in the first place. In my experience with both the state and the feds, I said, it's pretty universal that if you're a wildlife manager, you are going to spend most of your time working on people issues. If you work purely as a biologist focused on biological research, monitoring, modeling, impact assessment, and such things, as opposed to making on the ground management decisions, you are more technician than manager, for better or worse. But real wildlife management, in my view, involves the people component, human dimensions, and it's unavoidable. And I don't think it should be avoided, ignored, or minimized. I think the key thing that keeps a wildlife manager connected with people is what you just said. Joe jumped in as he finished putting another log in the fire. On the ground decisions. Because decisions affecting wildlife usually are in response to the desires of people, and those decisions also affect people. That's something else I figured out in grad school, Pat chimed in, somewhat to the surprise of the rest of us. There are entire disciplines dealing with management science and social dimensions that apply to natural resource management. My advisor had me take some of those courses so I wouldn't become what he called a over-educated technician. I enjoyed the courses actually, and I now see how they apply to real-world wildlife management. It seems we need to integrate people sciences with biological sciences so we can handle the people aspects of wildlife management. I haven't seen a lot of that occurring yet in my career, but I do see the need. Do you see it happening in your agencies? Well, most people in my agency haven't had that kind of training, so it's hard to integrate it formally into what we do, Joe replied. Perhaps some of our newer hires will be bringing this outlook to us. Let me know if you want to work for the feds. It's funny, though, said Becky, because in many programs today, just about all our training is in biology. Yet a lot of what we do on the job seems more in the realm of social and political sciences. I hear that some schools are emphasizing integration, which is very different from the traditional focus on discovery. People talked about integration when I was in college, but we really didn't know which non-traditional courses would be most valuable for a wildlifer. I've actually taken a business management course, and my agency paid for it. It used to be that they'd only send you to training for technical stuff like endangered species, population modeling, or other policy issues. What motivated you to take that course? I asked. I realized that I was dealing with all these challenges that I wasn't trained for and thought some new concepts could help me, Becky explained. It's like you and Pat said. A wildlife manager is different from a pure biologist because the manager, like it or not, has to factor people in. A manager needs to be able to integrate insight from these other disciplines that Pat was talking about to work through the day-to-day challenges. I hope to take more non-biology courses to broaden my perspective. They're relevant to my experience so far. They'll be useful in my work, and the longer I am a manager, the more I'm interested in non-biology subjects and their applications. My outfit puts on conflict resolution courses for employees, I said, but I always thought we should be learning how to avoid conflicts in the first place. So, Becky, Earl asked, pulling out his pocket knife and examining a small piece of cedar from the woodpile he had been rearranging. What have you applied from the course you took? The course was called Setting Objectives That Mean Something. I don't know if I've applied much yet, but I learned a bunch of things. Such as? Joe asked, raising his eyebrows. Becky laughed. Setting objectives. I never thought about different kinds of objectives, but just knowing there can be at least two kinds, fundamental and enabling, is useful to think about. What's the distinction? I asked. I never heard of objectives described that way. Fundamental objectives define your desired outcome, future condition, or goal, Becky explained. Enabling objectives describe milestones you need to meet along the way and outline approaches you can take to achieve your fundamental objective. Really? Earl commented as he began to whittle the cedar stick. I've never heard objectives defined that way. The objectives we write for our project plans and game seasons are more like what you call enabling objectives. They describe what we're going to do, but really don't specify what we're ultimately trying to achieve. I have a hard time keeping up with the biology, let alone the disciplines, Susan said quietly. They would have had to clone me if I had to get as much training in social science and political science as I got in biology. I wouldn't feel comfortable sacrificing any of the biological training I had. It's difficult enough trying to be a technical expert when so much new information is being generated by technicians and researchers who don't have to worry much about dealing with people. Just separating out the new information that's important for management from what's merely interesting or hypothesis is a chore, Earl added. I think that occurs by applying new ideas in actual management situations. Our state has been looking at adaptive harvest management, adaptive resource management, and adaptive impact management, Susan continued. The last one, AIM, is a new thing and deals with a lot of The last one, AIM, is a new thing and deals a lot with setting objectives and focusing on integrating biological and social sciences. But like I said, who has the time to really dig into social sciences? Sounds interesting. I'd like to learn more about that, said Pat. Although I was exposed to social sciences and encouraged to integrate biological and human dimensions, we never had a model for doing it. I know we all had the notion of the super manager, self-reliant, capable of handling any situation, alone in the wilderness, able to leap tall buildings, all that. But in reality, we don't have to know everything about everything. Whether or not we have a model for integrating it all, I suggested. And none of us can. For me, one of the hardest things I've come to grips with in my career has been the realization that I'll never have all the skills and training to address all situations. Without taking his eyes from the knife and the emerging artwork, Earl said, "The trick is to know when and where to tap somebody else's expertise. I go to our research people all the time for information and assistance because even with all my biological training, I can't answer every question for all the species I deal with as a manager. And I sure don't have a clue about the research on people issues. But we have a specialist, a sociologist by training, I think, in our outreach group. I've been working with her on some issues." I had a graduate seminar on communicating across disciplines, Pat said. It emphasized how difficult it is for management, biology, and sociology to integrate. As they become more specialized, they develop and communicate in a language or a bunch of acronyms or jargons, and that aggravates people in other disciplines. Yeah, it's easy for that to happen, even among specializations in the same fields, Joe added. It's natural to stick to what you know best and to talk with people of like mind and training. Earl, have you collaborated with both the sociologist and a biologist on projects? Becky asked. Just recently, Earl replied after a pause. My rapport with the sociologist has grown to where I'm willing to risk bringing her in at the ground level on an issue, and it's been working well so far. Time will tell whether her involvement really adds value. You sound skeptical, Earl, but I think what you are doing is important, Joe said. As wildlife managers responsible for integrating biological and sociological aspects of an issue, we need to bring people to the table who have the skills to do the job if we don't. I agree in theory, Susan chimed in, but what's really important in practice, as Becky suggested, is to have them working in conjunction so that both aspects, people and wildlife, are considered together. It's not easy. and how the human and biological aspects are balanced in decision making is the tricky part, I pointed out. But I'm not convinced that our role is to achieve a balance if it necessarily means equal weight. I don't think I know what balance looks like in many situations we encounter. Well, it makes you wonder sometimes, Earl said. If we don't tip the balance in favor of the critters, who will? I know I feel that way in my job, Becky sighed. But I also know that my values are coloring my perspective. Earl stood and performed a grimacing stretch for a second time, a piece of wood in his hand now smaller, but still not a recognizable form. Though biologists all, we were weeks, months, and in some cases years removed from day-long field labor. For the first 3 or 4 days of our project, we left the cabin in the low pre-dawn light, as chipper and chirping as 7 dwarfs on their merry way to mine, and we dragged home to the cabin silently at supper time, looking, I'm sure, a little like a blistered chain gang. We cooked, ate sparingly, did chores, maybe executed a painful field shower, and collapsed gratefully into sleeping bags, even before the last of daylight. The emergency response assignment, decidedly unfortunate from an ecological standpoint, was a good professional renewal, cathartic for some. It brought back memories of research and thesis projects in our student years, which we shared and maybe embellished over dinner times. Our appetites and stamina improved steadily and simultaneously. After the first few days, our fieldwork was not so exhausting, but it was physically rigorous enough for us to agree, one evening, to recommend sainthood for whoever invented ibuprofen. You know, Earl said, resuming his seat and his chipping away at the stick, a lot of wildlife managers don't realize that their personal values color their professional perspective. It gets them in trouble when they have to deal with people who have different values. It sounds like the old, do I work for the resource or do I work for the people dilemma, I said. Who do we work for? Susan asked. I paused for a moment. Both, I think. I don't really see it as an either-or distinction. Wildlife is a trust resource, so essentially the two are linked, Joe added. Isn't that why we are all in this business? Earl asked. To manage resources sustainably according to something called the public trust doctrine. Pat, reclining on the cabin floor, looked around the circle and said, I'm not familiar with that phrase, Earl. And just where are you carving, anyway? I'm not telling, Earl replied. I wait until I quit carving on it and then see what it resembles most. But I will tell you about the public trust doctrine. It derives from a 19th century Supreme Court ruling, and it's the bedrock for wildlife policy and law in this country. In essence, it established that no one can own wildlife. It is held in trust for all people by government. Don't schools teach this anymore? I'm familiar with the idea, but didn't recognize the phrase or realize where it came from or that it was that old, Pat said, sitting up. I wish we had been given more background on the history and development of the profession. Yes, that's too bad, I observed. The curriculum these days is so full of technical material, it leaves little time for history. I think that everyone in the profession should understand the cornerstones for wildlife management in America, starting with the fact that the wildlife is a public trust resource. Then it's not an issue of whether you work for the resource of the people. Our mandate is to maintain wildlife for the benefit of all people in present and future generations. That means protecting people from adverse effects of wildlife as well as conserving wildlife, Becky added, standing up and walking over to the window. Sometimes that mandate seems to have an inherent contradiction. Right. What if meeting the public interest has detrimental effects on the resources we're responsible for? I asked. That's where limits come into play, Susan replied. I see that our role as wildlife managers is to provide policy markers with the best information about those limits. So, do you tell the public up front what limits on use are acceptable and what ones aren't? Joe asked. How do we determine that? How do we determine that objectively? Earl returned to his sitting position. That's gotten me in a world of hurt in the past, he sighed. I've told people at public meetings what management will allow and what we won't, sort of as ground rules. That sets the stage for challenges when it looks like we are advocating for objectives or approaches that are offensive to some people. That could be just what were talking about earlier. Our training and values clashing with those of some of the public, said Joe. Yep, Earl replied. I suppose that's been true for all of us in at least some cases. I guess the trick is getting broad input from stakeholders early in the decision process, figuring out ahead of time where the rough spots are likely to be, and mitigating them as best as you can. We need to communicate what's going on and why, including the sideboards, so people will understand we aren't just making things up to suit our interests. The people need to know that we have legal mandates intended to be in the public interest. The outreach specialist is working with me on that. I'm not much of a communicator, but she has the technical chops to understand what's going on. She can make my words, she can take my words and translate them so they make sense to civilians. The whittling resumed. Susan looked concerned. It sounds like the wildlife manager could be without a role in the decision process if stakeholder input gets carried to the extreme, she said as she opened the stove and stoked the fire. The process doesn't have to exclude us, and by all means, it shouldn't, I said. We all need to recognize our values as individuals and our responsibilities to society as trustees of wildlife. At the same time, we can't afford to beat ourselves up if decisions don't always come out the way we think they should. Too often, I've seen wildlife managers take it too personally when a decision doesn't pan out as they hoped or when a recommendation isn't adopted. Our responsibility as public wildlife managers is to protect the public trust, but we can't control a lot of the factors that go into decisions that may not pan out the way we want them to. We shouldn't bear the burden for decisions influenced by stuff we can't control or always anticipate. In fulfilling our responsibility, Becky added, we need to integrate biological and social sciences in management decision making. Part of the process, Joe continued, is to engage the public in the decision making process and, at the start, make people aware of the agency's responsibilities and its management limits. That's how we maintain the public trust mandate for wildlife, Earl said, not looking up from his undetermined masterpiece. Earl's comment halted the conversation. Not knowing him very well, I was unable to judge whether he agreed with what he had said, or whether he agreed with what had been said, or whether he was simply trying to close off what was becoming a complex philosophical discussion at the end of a long week. For a moment, hissing from the stove replaced conversation and gave us some relief. Susan's expression showed that she was unconvinced or discomforted by the discussion. She stood up, yawned, and walked into the mudroom, where she located her jacket from amid the cluster of outer garments. It all sounds nice, she said, walking back into the main room and hunching into her jacket. But it's a little mixed up. We talk about the need to engage the public, to use social science and all, but then we all jump at the chance to just do biology, with a bunch of strangers in the boonies. Maybe some outside air will help me make sense of things. Anyone want to join? Whether it was a desire for fresh air or the prospect of continued conversation, the rest of us immediately and simultaneously rose and prepared to go out. Earl stretched one last time and folded and pocketed his knife before heading to the mudroom. It's a tent stake, he said to no one in particular.